be distracting us. All right, so let's start. We can actually, yeah. So we had explained what consent is. Okay, so there has to be. So this automatically implies precise terms of contract. We have not done that? Okay. Okay, fine. No problem. Let's cover consent. Okay, so it's covered in the other class because it was captured in their video. Never mind. So the point is we have covered all this, okay, these distinctions, right? And then we came to the certain general principles, which is one is this idea of consensus ad idem, which is the idea of which is intimately tied to the definition of consent in section 13, right? Which is, as you can see here, the definition of consent is agree on the same thing in the same sense. So here you can see automatically there is an idea that this is a very important idea, that there has got to be some kind of clarity and certainty about the terms. You understand that? Otherwise, how are you going to agree to the same thing in the same sense? Yeah, is this clear? So there's automatically this idea that the terms of contract should be quite precise so that there is no room for any kind of misunderstanding. This idea is generally, you can sort of build it around this section 13 definition, because otherwise how are they going to agree upon the same thing in the same sense? This will become quite important in several contract situations. All right, so this is what consent means, right? So this is here I just wanted to introduce the idea of consensus ad idem. This is called meeting of the minds, right? This is what is written here. So the Latin term is consensus ad idem, which is just the meeting of the minds. We both agree to the same thing in the same sense, right? That's what consent is. Right, now we'll just go through some of the particular sections where we have talked about. I'll just briefly mention section 7, which we have already discussed. That counter offer, all that section 7 says is, so section 7 lies in is actually in chapter 1, okay, which is talks about communication, acceptance and revocation of proposals. Revocation, you understand what is meant by revocation? We're not going to cover chapter 1 in that much detail except for section 7. Revocation, everyone understands?
Take it back.
Take it back, okay? Revocation means take it back. So I make you an offer, but before you accept the offer, I revoke the offer. You might see this in a lot of these cases where you are applying to universities and the university gives you an offer, or even in your placement, the company might give you an offer, but before you accept, the company may revoke the offer, in which case you can no longer accept it. Okay, so therefore that's what it means. So this is covered in chapter 1. So all we are trying to emphasize here, because this principle will become this principle will become important in some of the other cases, and so acceptance has to. So this is what we told you earlier also at the very beginning of the contracts module, that counter offer is not an acceptance. Okay, so if somebody offers to sell me something for $100 and I give an acceptance, so-called acceptance, saying that okay, I accept your offer, but let it be for $80. So that's not an acceptance because it's a counter offer. It's a counter offer for me to buy that thing for $80, which he's initially offering at $100. That's not acceptance. So the principle of contract law that is enshrined in section 7 is that acceptance, in order to convert a proposal into a promise, acceptance has to be absolute and unqualified, right? No ifs and buts. So therefore this is basically all that we are concerned with in section 7. Now we come to another very important section, which is which will help to dispel a lot of myths, which is section 9, right, which you see here, which is also in this chapter 1. Okay, promises express and implied. All right, so here what they're telling you is, so remember, why are promises important? How did we define agreement? Set of reciprocal promises, because reciprocal promises already defined, right? So in section 2 itself, so promises which form the consideration for each other. So instead of using such a big expression, we can just use the word reciprocal promises. So basically a set of reciprocal promises will create an agreement, right? So that's why promises are important to understand, because as soon as you have reciprocal promises, you will have an agreement, right? So therefore it's important to understand. So what they're clarifying here, now here we can dispel certain myths, because many people have myths about that contracts have to be written. There's no need for contracts to be written. Can you see the first? So you can see there are two types of promises, express and implied. Okay, what are express promises?
Just spoken?
Not spoken.
Expressed explicitly mentioned. Expressed in a certain way by way of actions or
No.
It is clearly mentioned.
Mentioned typically implies writing.
Written.
No. The definition is very clear in the act itself. See how broad the definition is and how simple it is. Insofar as the proposal or acceptance of any promise is made in words, promise is express. So essentially, what is an express promise? Is anything which is made in words. Any promise, okay, or acceptance, insofar as any promise that is made in words is an express promise. This is clear. The act is very clear, makes it very precise. The definition of express promise, it is made in words. Now, have they qualified? I taught you this usage of the language, that I'm qualifying a student as LLM student, which means that student is not a MCA student or a BCA student. I have qualified the nature of that student by adding the word LLM. So now this guy is only an LLM student. Is this clear? So similarly, this is what is meant by the word qualified. I had that discussion with you, remember? How to use the word qualified? You remember or no? You've forgotten, right? The accountants qualify the reports, the audited financial statements. Okay, so essentially here, now what is happening? Any promise made in words is an express promise. Now, have they qualified words? Have they qualified words here? Have they qualified it by saying spoken words or written words? No. And what is the rule? If they don't qualify it, that means it applies to all manifestation of words. Okay, so the moment you don't qualify something, that means that the normal interpretation will be that it applies to both spoken words, and in this case we are familiar with spoken words and written words, so this will apply to both words. So the first thing that you can see here is that it is not necessary for an agreement to be written, a contract, which if the agreement is seen to be a contract, that we don't have to have it written down. It can be in words, it can be in spoken words. If it just says words, that means it can be even spoken words. Is this point clear? Is everyone clear about this? Okay, now there's a normal confusion that happens which is symptomatic of a larger problem, which is that people think that how is it possible if it's a spoken word, like if we make an agreement, I make an agreement with Aman, and then later on I say, no, I never said any such thing. How is he going to prove it, right? So this problem, so here there is a fundamental mistake here which people make, which is that don't confuse how you're going to prove it. First try to understand what the state substantive law is saying. How to prove it is a separate issue. Okay, so first understand what the substantive law is, and then the question of how to prove it is a separate issue. You may or may not be able to prove it. Now, why this is important to have this in the substantive law? If you take an example of a wedding, where let's say a couple is exchanging wedding vows, okay, and let's say you treat the marriage as a contract, okay, in the sense under Muslim law, marriage is very clearly like a contract. So if they are getting married in front of hundreds of people, there are so many witnesses, right? So what you have is clearly you have a lot of witnesses, and you have spoken words, and you have a contract being formed by spoken words, right? Now, if it were true, so there should not be a problem proving it because you have so many witnesses, right? Now, but nothing is put down in paper. Now, if the law had said that, if the law had actually put this here, if they had put in written words, if they had put this in the law, okay, then only written contracts would be enforceable. Okay, so this is the importance of writing the law like this, that how to prove it, that maybe you may be able to prove it in certain situations, you may not be able to prove in certain situations. So it's important to understand what the substantive law is talking about. So remember in your unit 1, now we are already in unit 2, but in unit 1 towards the end I told you to do some self-study. One of the items to be done under self-study is substantive laws versus procedural laws. Okay, so like the CRPC is a procedural law, the Registration Act is largely a procedural law, the Code of Civil Procedure, these are all procedural laws, whereas IPC, Contract Act, these are all substantive laws. So substantive laws give rights and liabilities. Okay, like if you look at a recent controversy, you take CAA and NRC and all this thing, all these kinds of controversies. CAA is an example of a substantive law. Why is it a substantive law? Because it is conferring certain rights on certain classes of people. It is saying that certain classes of people can claim citizenship, so this is giving certain rights. So that's why it's a substantive law. And things like if you do NRC and all later on, then you have, that is going to be more on procedure, how to prove certain things, right? So that is a separate issue. So here again you'll see that, so the first lesson to understand here is, obviously there is no such thing in the statute which confines the contract to written words. So any promise made in words is an express promise, okay? So one thing you have to learn in general for life, because later on in the organizations also you'll see the same kind of problem. When you are proposing certain kind of measures, okay, like say when we were proposing this method of keeping attendance, because everybody used to keep attendance like in the registers, you know, like where it is kept in the hard copy register. So when we propose this kind of new method, the normal criticism is that, oh, nobody is going to follow it. So that's like saying that, okay, this procedure, this new suggestion will not work. You assume that nobody is going to follow it, but you really don't know. People might follow it or they might not follow it. And even somebody following it, it's not static. Like people may not, maybe 10% will follow it in the first month, 40% will follow it in the second month. So even how you implement something, that is also not something that remains static. So always remember that when you're evaluating the merit of some idea, you do not assume that the idea cannot be implemented properly and therefore it's not a good idea. You have to evaluate the actual merit of the idea. Are you following what I'm saying? Yes? Because you will find, for instance, in this, again, if you come back to our normal debate, which is a topical debate in India, many of the people who are objecting to CAA, their objection is that how will I prove that I am a citizen? Okay, so that is a separate issue. So when you are evaluating CAA, for instance, there are two not necessarily linked. You can have CAA without NRC, you can have NRC without CAA. So there is a basic confusion. Even highly educated people are making this mistake. They are criticizing CAA. You can criticize it, but not for this reason, that how will I prove? That's a separate matter. So you have to understand this confusion. This is a very common confusion. So you should always remember that the merit of any idea, substantive merit of some idea, has to be assumed. When you are evaluating that, you have to assume that it can be implemented in a fair and it will be followed properly by everybody. And then is the idea good or bad? That's how you should evaluate it. So similarly here, understand that this is what the law says. If you can show that there was, if you can show, in some cases you may not be able to show, but if you can show that there was a promise made in words, that's an express promise, and that is valid under Indian contract law. This is clear? And the law is so broad that it also includes implied promises. What are implied promises? It's there in the section itself. You just have to read. Promises made otherwise than in words. Simple. Promises made otherwise than in words are implied promises. Okay. Otherwise than in words would be what? Action. And remember, action under the law means inaction also. Right? So for instance, if you say, if I'm selling something, maybe outside a temple, I'm selling certain, maybe set of flowers or something like that, which you can use in the temple. So if somebody is coming, everybody is coming and taking one set and leaving 5 rupees, and everybody else is coming, and so I'm agreeing to it. I'm not stopping him. Okay, so here there is no word that is being exchanged. Okay, it is consent. That means that thing is worth 5 rupees. That means I'm agreeing to sell that item for 5 rupees because everybody comes and drops 5 rupees and takes the bundle. So there is no, I've not put a price list anywhere. So if that happens and I don't complain, that means it is understood that through I've not done anything, I've not said anything, there's nothing written anywhere, but through my actions it is understood that there is an agreement to sell this for 5 rupees. Is this clear? Okay, so it can be even, so there's a famous case, in fact Hidayatullah has given the judgment for that there's a forced, there's price fixing in the case of cement. The government has fixed the price. So there's a price cap in the case of cement, and a company was selling cement and they were actually saying that this is not an agreement because there is no free consent. The government has forced us, actually there's forced sale of cement to certain authorized dealers, okay, which the government has set up. So the people were saying that this is not a free consent, there's no free consent in this case, but Hidayatullah said that because you are continuing, everybody knows about the system and you are still continuing to sell cement, you have the option of not being in the cement business, but you're continuing to sell cement, that means you are consenting to this agreement. So there is implied consent from your actions, right? So this is what it means here. So the law on contract formation is very broad. It does not even have to have words in it. It can be implied from the actions of parties, right? So that is what you should understand, that the contract formation aspect is very broad. Okay, from the conduct of parties it may be inferred. All right. So what we will do here, since we've covered. Which one? The otherwise than in words. The implied promise.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
The government has forcefully fixed the price.
Yeah,
So,
and also forcefully forced you to sell. Like you can't sell to anybody, anyone and everyone that you want to sell to. You have to sell to certain set of authorized dealers, which the government has nominated. So the dealers were saying in that case there was a dispute, right, about a sales tax. This is actually a sales tax case. So they were saying there is no sale because in order for there to be a sale, there has to be a contract, and in order for there to be a contract, there has to be free consent. So because the rule on sale of goods is unless there is a contract, there cannot be a sale. All right, so you can't levy sales tax. The dispute was basically they wanted to levy sales tax, and these guys, the assessees, were saying that you can't levy sales tax because there is no sale without a contract of sale, and there is no contract of sale because our consent is not free. Government is forcing us to sell to these ABC dealers. So there Hidayatullah said that no, you are continuing, you know the system exists and you are continuing to be in this business. You have the option of exiting from the business. You are continuing to be in this business. So by your conduct, we assume that you consent to this arrangement. So therefore he has treated his, you can disagree with that opinion, but in fact when he first gave the opinion, that was a minority opinion. Later on people accepted this view. So the point is this, that this is the kind of inference that courts will make. From the conduct of parties, people will assume that they are agreeing to this arrangement. Is this point clear? Like the temple example that I gave you, a slightly better example. So if somebody is, let's say, also you can take an example of somebody is doing my garden every month, and every month I'm giving him 2,000 rupees. Now there was no agreement of any sort. Okay, he did the garden, then he came and I gave him 2,000 rupees. Every month this goes on, then one month I decide not to pay him. But then again he'll be able to enforce the agreement in the court, because the court will imply from the actions that there was an agreement that there would be a payment of 2,000 rupees every month if the garden is properly taken care of. Okay, because again from the conduct of parties they see that they are doing this every month, so there must be an implied agreement. This is clear? Are you guys following? After lunch people are falling asleep. Okay, all right. So yeah, if this is clear now, Shaurya, your point is it clear? Shaurya is not happy with Hidayatullah's logic, but this is yeah, I agree with you that it's a slightly problematic logic because you are forced to be selling to that party. But what he is saying essentially is that you can exit from this.
Can I share my opinion on it? Just an opinion.
Sorry?
Can I share my opinion on it?
No, you can share your opinion on it.
It's like some kind of fascist.
Some kind of
Fascist approach.
fascist, yeah, you can say that. Yeah, all kinds of government. Anytime, if you look at it from that point of view, actually most of our it's a fascist country because the government controls so many aspects of your life, right? So this is one of the reasons why we are not very developed as an economy. We have the potential to be much more developed, but this is because the government interferes in every aspect of life, economic life. So that's one of the reasons why we are not developed. So yeah, this is basically state control. Yeah.
But anyone can then make us liable in that light by giving the logic of implied promise.
Not so easy, because you have to show that the conduct. You have to show that it's not so easy, because you have to show that the conduct of parties is such that an agreement, the existence of an agreement can be, that consent can be inferred, or the existence of an agreement can be inferred. It's not so easy. You can't just do it in any situation because the conduct has to be such, right? Yeah.
So how they'll be proving it?
Okay, that again, as I said, so what Arora is asking is how will they prove it? That again differs from case to case. You have to show from the circumstances of the case, and in every case you may not be able to prove it. Okay, but the point is that the substantive law accepts this principle. That is why in this case of the sales tax case, they said that there was eventually a sale because there is consent, because these guys, these cement manufacturers who are being forced to sell to the authorized dealers set up by the government, they have the option of not being in the cement business. They can shut their business and go somewhere else and do something else. So the fact that they're continuing to be in the business implies that they have consented to this arrangement. And that's how they have, so that's how the court has, so how you'll prove it is a matter of individual circumstances of each case and how the court interprets it, right? But the point is always that the substantive law recognizes even these types of contracts, even these types of promises which are not even made in words but are inferred from the conduct of parties. This is clear? Yes? Lokesh, you are getting ready to talk. Looks like you're getting ready to score some runs. Okay. Alright, is this clear so far? Another example of implied contract. Okay, we have given 3 examples. One is the cement sales tax case, one is the temple case, alright, the other is the gardening case. Okay. Yeah, I know. The examples are not very good, but something which you come across regularly. I can't think of anything at the moment off the top of my head. Yeah.
Like it's coming to the class on a particular time. If you are late, you will be marked absent. It is an implied case. You will not be getting the attendance. It is implied.
No, that has actually been declared already. I have told you. How do you know? I have told you. How do you know that it's 5 minutes and 10 minutes? Because I have told you.
It is not it's general rule that.
No, if it is rule, no, it will not fit, because if it is a rule, then it is either written somewhere or somebody has told you. So this is not an example of implied, because there are words involved. Because remember, implied promise means there can't be any words. Remember, because what is the definition of an implied promise? A promise made otherwise than in words.
So it could be like parking the car somewhere. Like everyone is parking their car to a certain place, there is no one regarding that, and everybody is just parking their car.
Yeah, parking the car and paying some fee to the attendant where he's not asking for the fee, you're just paying him something. That could be an example of where there is no words there. So essentially for implied promise, you need to have this property that there should not be words involved. Now Anisha will also lose. Remember that you can be marked absent, but you can still lose marks. Okay, so you lose marks now. So that is the point. That's the risk of staying in the class when you are absent. That means you can be absent, but you can lose marks. Okay, yes, Aurora, you understood. So anytime there are words, you can't call it an implied promise. There has to be complete absence of words, and only then will there be an and still you can, if you can infer some kind of promise from the conduct of parties, then you have an implied promise. Okay.
For example,
Yeah.
For example, sir, ignorance of law is no excuse, but we do something, so is that a case of implied consent?
No, that will not be. So Siddharth is talking about a principle in the law, which is that ignorance of law is not an excuse. Like I can't murder somebody and then say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that murder was illegal. Okay, I may not have actually read the provision of the IPC, but that's not an excuse. Okay, so the principle is that ignorance of fact is acceptable, but ignorance of the law is not acceptable, right? So when Hamlet puts a spear into the curtain and he doesn't know there's someone there, he just puts a spear into the curtain and there's somebody behind the curtain and the person dies, that's acceptable because he didn't know there was anyone there. He was just trying to show how the spear works. So yeah, that's it. Yeah. So what? Yeah. Any other question?
Sir.
Yeah.
Sir, in Indian currency it is written, I promise to pay the bearer X amount. Like when the demonetization happened,
Quiet. I'm just going to take this out because I feel like my voice is not coming through and I end up shouting. Yeah. Yes.
Sir,
demonetization happens. Yeah.
Yeah. In the Indian currency it is written, I promise to pay the bearer X amount.
So what are you saying this is? This is a breach of that promise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a breach of that promise, but the point is that 1 minute. So in this case, what has happened is that this is an example of, so you're very right, there's a very good point that he has made, that if you are promised to pay the bearer the sum of the so many, but remember in demonetization what they did was essentially not they're saying you have to deposit that money. If you deposit that money in the bank, then you get the credit. It's just that they're saying that the cash which is lying around, that will,
So the government is different and institution is different, like
RBI.
Prime Minister is saying
No, RBI is considered to be a part of the executive branch. Okay, so RBI is slightly different from Finance Ministry. So we say the head of the executive branch is actually technically the president, but effectively it is de facto head of the executive branch is the Prime Minister. So the Ministry of Finance is closer to the Prime Minister. Okay, but the RBI is slightly distant from the Prime Minister, but it is all part of the same level of the executive branch, dealing with finance and currency and all that. So they're all part of the same executive branch of government. Yeah. So what is your point here?
that's the only point I have.
Yeah. So in this case, what they were saying is that if you deposit the money, that's why there was a queue to deposit the money, right? There were queues. So it's not that they're invalidating they're just saying that the cash cannot be used for legal tender at that point, but if you deposit the money, they will pay you the equivalent. So they're not really breaching the contract as such, right? But with the case of governments, in the case of governments, there's always such a risk because the government has police power. So the government can abrogate contracts, then you have to sue the government in the court and make sure that, because then they'll say that there's a public policy argument which we will see later. So all this, it becomes very difficult if the government is determined on a particular point, it becomes very difficult to win against the government on a public policy issue because they can raise that point on public policy.
So,
Yeah.
so many people have been died in the queues for change.
Yeah, so those are all consequences of a particular policy.
So can't we say that the government is breach the promise and the people
The government is?
breach the promise that the people who standing in the queues has been died? from
No,
the
people dying in the queue, that's a separate issue. People dying standing in the queue, that's a separate issue. So they have not broken the promise because they have actually, they are honoring the promise if you deposit the money. They are only making a rule that this is no longer legal tender in the form of cash currency notes. The currency notes have been invalidated, but if you submit it, you will get the credit. So there's, in that sense, they are not violating the promise. Yeah, 1 minute. Yeah, 1 second. We'll go to Utsav first.
If somebody has a restaurant,
Yeah.
and I go there, is it an implant of that I should be served?
No, there is no implied. I mean, if you go there generally, yeah, because there are anti-discrimination laws and all that. So they should normally they are required to serve you. They can't really discriminate against you.
That
Yeah.
can be an implied contract.
Yeah, but that being served is a more general term. In that sense, yeah, you can say that. But effectively, you will have to go and ask for something, right? So there, what happens is you will select, okay, like I want the masala dosa. You say, okay, I will have this masala dosa, which is priced at 100 rupees, and then he will have to accept your offer.
You cannot deny that.
He cannot deny that. Okay, generally that will be based on the anti-discrimination laws and all that. Yeah.
So like recently.
1 minute. Let's go to Shivam first. He has raised his hand. Yeah.
Like if we join a PGDM program, and
Yeah.
the PGDM manual is there, so we need to follow it. Is it an implied?
No, it's not implied because the PGDM manual has words in it.
Sir, but joining PGDM program and following that PGDM manual, like for that, there is no implied like written that we need to follow it. But
No. If you see the whatever agreement you're signing when you enter the program, right? That will say that you will have to comply with the rules and regulations of the institute. That will be written, and it will also say that the institute reserves the right. Typically, the institute reserves the right to sell to change its rules and regulations without any notice.
it's express.
Typically, most institutes will write the rules like this.
So you call it an express.
These are all express because they are in words. So implied, remember, implied, there cannot be any words, either spoken or written. So it is only from the conduct of parties. Is this clear? Yeah.
So like let's take an example of restaurant. We are giving service tax, but there is not written anywhere that service tax would be applied or it would be taken. But it was later by the law it was given that you can claim back that service charge.
You can?
Claim back that service charge.
Yeah.
But sir, before that there was nothing about the service charge, so it was implied by restaurant to the customer.
Yeah, so this is a slightly better example. What Aurora is talking about is the when we pay service charges in certain restaurants. So we have agreed. So there you can say that as far as the service charge component is concerned, that if we are agreeing by eating at that restaurant, we are agreeing to pay essentially any other levies which they are normally allowed to levy, which may not be expressly written in the. Typically, they are not written in the price also, right? So if you see the price does not include taxes, okay, which is actually not strict. Actually, they should be sued under the Consumer Protection Act. But nobody includes actual final prices. Even in the Western countries, they don't include the full price. So if you go and pay something, it shows as $100. When you go to pay, it's actually $100 plus tax. So actually, they should declare the full tax. That would be the proper way under the consumer protection rules. But this is a better example where if you eat in a restaurant, you are consenting to all the other charges that they are allowed to levy, like service tax and all, service charges and all that, right? Yeah. All right, is this clear? So you can have implied promises. So it is not necessary to have a contract in words, because many people think that contracts have to be written and they have to be registered and all that. No such requirement exists under Indian law. All right, so now we come to section 10, okay, which is section 10 is basically the starting of chapter 2, okay, which is a pretty big chapter. But you'll see that here at this stage, is it disturbing you, the sound?
Yes.
Is the sound okay? Yeah. So basically, if I have to feel comfortable, there's a little bit of an echo. All right. So if you see section 10, what will happen is it's very interesting, because you will jump from section 10. You can cover all the other sections in chapter 2. So this is a very important section, because it makes you jump to all the other sections of chapter 2. Let's have a look at it. So section 10 essentially tells you this. When you have this, remember you have this. You have this set up, right? Some agreements are going to be contracts and some agreements will not be contracts. All right. Yeah, some agreements will be contracts and some will not be. Okay, some will be void agreements. So the question is, so how would we know whether an agreement is going to be a contract or not? Whether an agreement is to be treated as a contract or not? How would we know that? Right? That's a valid question, because you have to have some rules for deciding whether a certain agreement is a contract. Before I forget, let me give the marks for Anisha. All right. So, right. So this is a valid question, because for any agreement, the question will arise: how do we know that this is a contract? So you have to go to section 10, where it shows there are 5 filters in section 10, right? If you see how section 10 is worded, it is worded like this. If you look at section 10 here. Can you see? It's all, we are really mainly concerned with the first part of section 10, which is this part here. All right. You can see here that it is, it's just a jumble of words, right? So what I've tried to do is I've tried to split it up, okay? But if you read this here, can you see here? Free consent of parties, I will split it up, and these notes are all going to be pasted into your notes, okay? These are already in your notes, these things that I'm talking about from the Act. All agreements or contract made by free consent of parties competent to contract, comma, for a lawful consideration. Now, when you say comma for a lawful consideration, does it mean this or this, or this and this? And this. Okay, so the first thing to notice is it sets up various conditions in the first part, and they are to be read as and, not or. So what I've done is just to make it a little easier to understand, I have explicitly split it up, put in some Roman 1s and 2s, and put stuff in bold, so it's easier to understand the 5 filters. So section 10 actually contains 5 filters, and because you already determined that these 5 filters are read in the sense of A and B and C and D and E, so that they're not A or B or C. It is or and, not or. So that means that in order for an agreement to be deemed a contract, it must pass through all the 5 filters of section 10, right? So this is already in your notes, so you have to just understand this concept that there are 5 filters in section 10. So for any agreement to be deemed a contract, it must pass all the filters. So if it fails even one filter, then it's not a contract, because it's in the sense of and, A and B and C, etc., not in the sense of or. So it must pass all the filters, otherwise it will not be a contract. Is this clear? Are you following? Yes? So what is the first filter? Free consent. Okay, free consent. There are 2 words to it, two words here, free and consent. Okay. So let's look at where consent is defined. If we look at this, yeah. So where is consent? Consent is in section 13. We have already looked at consent, agreeing to the same thing in the same sense. Now what is free consent? Free consent is in section 14. You notice how section 10 is making you jump to the other sections. It's leading you to the other sections. You'll see that basically from section 10 you can reach all the other sections. So when we try to investigate consent and free consent, we are led to sections 13 and 14. So if you look at section 14, what is free consent? Here. So free consent is any consent which is basically not vitiated by any of these problems. Whenever somebody's consent, remember consent, people have to agree to the same thing in the same sense, right? So I am agreeing with the shopkeeper that he will sell me this iPhone and I will pay him 60,000 rupees. So so nobody's consent should be vitiated. So coercion is one example. If I'm holding a gun to the head of the shopkeeper and I'm forcing him to sell the iPhone at 10,000 rupees, then that consent is not free, because there is coercion. Okay, so therefore that agreement is not enforceable. So if I demand that later on he fulfill the agreement to sell me an iPhone at 10,000, that's not enforceable because the consent is not free. So what will happen, any type of situation like this, undue influence exists when you have any situation where one person can influence the will of the other person. Like if you have a teacher-student relationship, which is not an equal relationship, because the teacher can influence the student's grades and all that. So therefore any agreement between teacher and student, like if I decide to buy an iPhone from a student at 10,000 rupees, that agreement will also be vitiated by lack of free consent, because the teacher has undue influence over a student. Okay, so we'll say in this case the student's consent is not free. Is this clear? These are all cases where we're not going to go so much into detail of all these elements, but essentially these are all examples of cases where your consent is not free. Then you have fraud and misrepresentation, where basically these are very similar to each other, but misrepresentation is slightly more subtle. Okay, slightly more subtle. Fraud is much more explicit. You can see what fraud and all is defined. Fraud is defined in section 17 and misrepresentation is defined in 18. So fraud, you can see what it is. One obvious, not so obvious definition of fraud is when you make a promise without any intention of performing the promise. That is also fraud. Okay, if you suggest that something is true and you know that it's actually not true, that is also fraud. So all these cases where like the case that happened in the case of the girl who got married to an old man, okay, that was a case of fraud because they knew that the groom was not a young man, but they presented the groom as a young man. So they suggested as a fact that which is not true. So they suggested the man is young, but they knew that he was not a young man, right? So any of such situation, whenever you have any contract which is vitiated, where the consent is vitiated by, say in this case, fraud, that's why, yeah.
Sir, for example, if the contract is dead and it is registered with
Sorry, come again.
registrar.
If it's
The contract is changed and it is registered in front of the registrar. So after that, these 5 filters can be challenged.
still, because if you can show that, because if I can hold a gun to his head to make him sign the contract, then he can go and register it. Okay, but the point is that's not, the contract don't need to be registered. So generally people don't register contracts, okay, unless we are talking about property. Property registration is a different matter. It's governed by the Registration Act. Okay, so that's why in general contracts in general, there is no requirement of registration of contracts. But if the contract deals with transfer of property, then that gets hit by the Registration Act. Okay, the section 17 of the Registration Act, which says that anything over 100 rupees when you're transferring property. So that is why you're registering, not because the contract needs to be registered. Okay, so contract doesn't need to be registered, but any agreement which somebody is trying to enforce, you can attack on any of these limbs, any of these 5 filters. Because if you can show there is coercion, then everything is vitiated by coercion, right? So yeah, is this clear? Are you guys following what the structure is? So there are 5 filters. We can briefly look at the 5 filters: free consent, competency, consideration has to be lawful, object has to be lawful, and it should not have been declared to be void. This is an arbitrary classification. This is an arbitrary category, not hereby declared. This is an arbitrary category, so there's no real logic in it. But here, these we can understand through logic. But the point to understand is, any agreement, the attitude of the lawyer is, if the lawyer is trying to defend against enforcement of any agreement, if somebody is trying to enforce an agreement against you and you don't want to perform that agreement, the strategy that you should have is to try and show that that agreement fails to pass any one of the filters of section 10. If you can show that it fails to pass any of the filters, then you will be able to show that this agreement is not a contract, and then it is not enforceable. Are you following the strategy, the logic? Okay, this is how it's going to work. So free consent, now you understand. Free consent means it should be pure consent. There should not be any kind of impurity because of coercion or undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, right? All these kinds of things should not vitiate the consent. Free consent. Competency to contract, let's look at competency. Free, everything is there in your notes. It's been extracted here. Okay. Then competency to contract, there are 2 elements, 3 elements actually. The third one again is arbitrary class. First is age of majority, because we assume that people who are minors are not competent to evaluate the it's a little bit similar to the unsound mind. People who are minors are not adult enough to be able to evaluate the pros and cons of a particular contract and how it affects their interest. Okay, so therefore they are not allowed to enter. Their contracts are not enforceable against minors. There are some exceptions when it comes to supply of necessities and all that, but we don't need to get into that. But in general, contracts are not enforceable against minors. All right, that's why you notice that any kind of child pornography, then having sexual relations with people below the age of consent, all these are made illegal, because essentially the idea is that these people are too young to give their consent, to give free consent and mature consent. They are not of the ability. They have not attained the age of majority. So age of majority in India is 18 years. Otherwise, if it's determined by the Indian Majority Act, or if the court has appointed a guardian, then it's 21 years. Okay, if there's a court-appointed guardian, then the majority will be reached at the age of 21. Okay, so you must not be a minor. Okay, and you must be of sound mind. Okay, so what is a sound mind? If you see, so sound mind, again, what the question will arise: what is a sound mind?
Not schizophrenic.
Yeah.
Not schizophrenic.
Not schizophrenic, no, not necessarily, because there could be, if the part schizophrenic only means that you have 2 minds. Schizophrenic only means you have 2 minds. So if one of those minds is a sound mind, then it will be okay. If you look at the definition, you understood what Shaurya is saying? He's saying sound mind means you should not be a schizophrenic, but that's not true, because schizophrenic only means that there are 2 minds. Okay, so therefore all that you have is you have to just see the definition of sound mind, which is given in 12 here. I think I've given it in your notes also. No, it's okay. Sound mind. Okay, let's look at the definition here. Okay, sound mind here is he should be capable of understanding it, okay, and forming a rational judgment as to its effect upon his interest. This is important. This is typical legal language. You should be able to form a rational judgment as to its effect upon his interest. Here, interest is not principal plus interest in your fixed deposit. This is interest as in it affects my interest, okay, against my self-interest, that kind of interest, okay. This is what it means. So the reason that George's point is not correct is, what does it say here? Look at the second part here. You have to be able to evaluate these kinds of points, right? Otherwise, you may be in a situation where you're arguing with someone and somebody makes a point like what Sergio has made. The reason his point is wrong is, a person who is usually of unsound mind but occasionally of sound mind may make a contract when he is of sound mind. Okay? Look at this situation. So if you have a schizophrenic, maybe in one, it only means schizophrenic only means he has two minds. So one of those minds may be a sound mind. So when he's in that sound mind, he can make a contract and it will be a valid contract. So that point is not necessarily correct, but there is a reverse condition here. So you understand what is a sound mind here. Yeah.
The contracts made under the excess of alcohol would be void.
No, it's not really undue influence. It is basically what will happen is, when he makes it, he is not capable of understanding it and forming a rational judgment. This is the problem. This is going to be the problem, the point that Siddharth is making. Okay, he is already looking for the day to be over and he's thinking of alcohol. So now, so the problem that will happen is that essentially what you are saying is that at that point, if you are under the influence of alcohol, it's not undue influence, but it's actually that you are not capable of understanding the impact of you're not capable of forming a rational judgment as to the effect of the contract upon your interest. All right. So essentially, this will be the problem. You have to be able to show that the other guy has to basically, put you in and the other guy should be aware that you're in a drunken state, that you're not in a position to have to give free consent, right? To have a sound mind. Yeah. Somebody else?
If I don't know about the topic, and if the person is not knowing about the topic, then he is not able to understand it.
Yeah.
So that would be also categorized.
No, then if you represent, depends on what it is. Like if you see, remember that consent says that you agree to the same thing in the same sense. So if you don't understand something, then how are you going to agree to it? I mean, if I'm agreeing to buy a nuclear reactor in good condition. Now, if I don't have the technical ability to evaluate whether a nuclear reactor is in good condition, then I will not have, essentially that means I can't consent to it, right? I can't consent to it. Is this clear? Right? So that will be under consent, because you can't understand the same thing in the same sense. You have to be able to understand it. It implies that you have to be able to understand it. Okay? All right? Okay. So, are you following the structure of section 10 and how it leads you to all the other sections? Okay? Competent to contract, you should be competent to contract, and not disqualified means there should not be some disbarment coming from some other type of law, okay, which prevents you from contracting under certain situations, right? So the second one is competency, third one is lawful consideration. So there was a question asked in one of your seniors' situations. Now we'll have to deduct marks for Ketan and Yash also. That area they have been infected by Anisha. They are also losing marks. This is like instead of coronavirus, this is coronavirus. So, where is Ketan? And Yash is down. So both Yash and Anisha have the unique distinction of not being present but still earning negative marks for a particular day. It's a unique distinction. Okay. Right, let's go back to the situation here because we are running a little bit behind. Okay, guys, second is competency. Lawful consideration. So here you take an example from the last year, one of your seniors asked this question. So if a groom agrees to get married to a girl, but he insists on some amount of dowry being paid, Okay, some amount of dowry has to be paid. So then later on the girl's side agrees to pay the dowry, but later on after the wedding they have not paid the dowry. Now the question is, can the groom enforce the agreement to pay dowry for the marriage? No. The problem is because claiming dowry is not lawful, right? So it will get now. So the point is, you have to understand what is the exact way that in which the agreement will fail. It will fail on the third limb. It fails on the third filter of section 10 because the consideration is not lawful. The consideration because the guy agreed to enter into the contract of marriage on the payment of dowry. So that is the consideration moving from the bride's side. Now the consideration moving from the bride's side is not lawful, what he has demanded. So therefore this will not proceed from agreement status to contract status because it fails the third filter. Is this clear? Lawful consideration, it has to be lawful. Like I gave the other example in the other class where Vipul agrees with me that he will rob Jaka's house and I will pay him 10,000 rupees. He goes and robs Jaka's house, but then he comes to claim the money from me and I say I'm not going to pay him. One second. Now Vipul cannot successfully sue me in court for that 10,000 because the consideration that is robbing Jaka's house, that is unlawful activity. Okay, so the consideration is not lawful. All right. I can't hear what you're saying. We'll just assume it's not that important. It's not a question, right? Okay, guys. Now one sec, quickly. We have to finish a lot of material here in this class. Okay. So third, you have understood what is lawful consideration. If the consideration is not lawful, it will fail. Okay, the contract will not pass through filter number 3. Filter 4 is lawful object. Object is similar to consideration. It's not been distinguished in the Contract Act. But a useful way to think about object is to think about where did I write that? I think I wrote that in the draft notes. I thought I wrote that. Okay, maybe I don't know why it's not here. Okay, I did write about. Yeah, it's here. Okay, lawful consideration and lawful object. Okay, so consideration versus object. Object is high level, consideration is low level. Okay, let's try and understand it here. This is basically that now you have understood consideration. So consideration, let's say maybe that. Yeah.
Suppose a person in India contracts with a person in USA, and suppose in India it is unlawful.
Yeah.
And in USA it is lawful.
Yeah.
So this contract will be valid or not?
So contract will not be valid because how is it unlawful? You have to specify how is it unlawful.
It is unlawful in India. Rules are framed accordingly that it is unlawful, but in USA it is valid.
Yeah. So here the question will arise as to where was the contract formed. There's a problem of there's one particular case on this which we are not going to cover in our syllabus, but this is a question. This will raise the question of where was the contract concluded, at what point. Okay, so who gave the offer, who gave the acceptance, where was the acceptance given? So there we'll have to determine. So this will become slightly a mixed question of fact and law. So we have to figure out where because this kind of cases will give rise to the question of in what location was the contract formed. Okay, so then we'll have to go into that element. So wherever that location is, if it was not lawful in that location, then it will not be a valid agreement. Okay, guys, quickly to understand difference between law of consideration and object. Object is a high level situation like intention and motive. So in criminal law you have the distinction between intention and motive. Motive is high level and intention is low level. If you take criminal law, like if you have one brother, let's say there are two brothers, and the younger brother, if he can kill his elder brother, he will get the entire inheritance. Okay, so here the intention is that he strikes the elder brother with sufficient force so that he knows that force will kill the elder brother. That is the case of that is where you see his intention. His intention is to strike his elder brother with so much force that maybe with a hard object so that the elder brother dies. This is clear. And what is the motive? The motive is to claim the entire inheritance. Is this clear? So this is what is the distinction between motive and intention. That intention is low level, okay, and very specific. What happened now? Srishti also wants to score some runs. I don't know why you're scoring runs in these late overs. Srishti, right? In front of Siddharth, you're Srishti? Okay. So you become creative in the later part of the class. Yeah. Okay. What? No, it doesn't matter. You don't have implied promise. You don't have to speak. Any kind of activity which distracts the teacher, okay? Which any kind of attempt to communicate, any activity which distracts the teacher. Okay, guys, now one sec. We have to cover a lot of material. Alright, so this is what it is. So consideration is essentially what is specifically done in the as part of the contract. So maybe I'm trying to build suppose I build a particular, maybe I'm building a swimming pool as part of a larger complex. So when I enter into a contract with a particular builder to construct the swimming pool, so here the consideration that flows from his side is only the construction of the swimming pool. But maybe my motive is, my object is really to build a larger sports complex. Okay, so there is a slightly higher level objective there, which is, and the consideration is just a means to an end. You understand the concept of means and ends? Means to an end. Something is a means to an end. The end is the objective, and means is how you get there. Okay, so this is basically, it's a little bit like means and ends also. So consideration is more like means, and object is more like ends. Okay, so it's just like me. I can write down means and ends also here. You guys haven't heard this concept of means and ends. Means is how you do it, and ends is what you eventually achieve. Okay, the result. So essentially object and consideration are like means, and ends are like intention versus motive in criminal law. You have some idea now. Consideration is a low level. Object is maybe to build a larger sports complex, but in a particular contract I am asking a guy to construct a swimming pool. So the consideration in that contract is the construction of the swimming pool, for which my consideration will be some payment of money from my side. Okay, and he will construct the swimming pool. So that's what it is. Okay, so lawful, either the object and consideration both have to be lawful, and they should not be hereby expressly declared to be void. The way this works is, this is an arbitrary category, number 5. The legislature has arbitrarily decided that certain types of contracts are void. So for instance, if you go here, you see 25 to 30. Okay, what types of agreements are void? What are falling in the fifth category? Agreement and restraint of marriage. I agree to hire somebody on the condition that she will not get married. Okay, during the employment she will not get married. You can't have these kind of agreements. These are all void. You can't enforce. So then later on she gets married during the employment, and then you want to fire her. That firing is not legitimate, because the agreement, to the extent that it specifies she can't get married, that is not valid. So that kind of agreement is declared void. Agreement and restraint of trade. If you have a team in the IPL which hires a player saying that you are hired, but if you leave the team then you can't play for any other team for the next 5 years, that part will not be enforceable, because you are restricting his trade. You are restricting him from earning his living, right? Practicing his profession. So those kind of things. There are some exceptions in this, that you have non-compete agreements. Those of you, non-compete agreements are under restriction, but there are some, that is the exception, not the rule. Non-compete is an exception, not the rule. So there are certain conditions under which you will do a case in corporate law where this will come up. Okay, what are the conditions under which agreement and restraint of trade is valid? All right. So yeah.
So for example, if you take placement, some placements also take a contract or a agreement that you will not leave the organization before 2 years.
Yeah. So those are actually, see, those are all dubious. So he's mentioned a correct point. Now what happened? Walia also wants to lose some marks. What are you doing? Look straight. Now, those kinds of agreement which Aurora is mentioning, they happen when people hire you. They put in some non-compete clauses. I've seen some of these cases where Care Ratings also has that kind of thing. But essentially what we hear is people are not enforcing that. Whenever you go to enforce that, that is a debatable clause. Okay. The essential rule is, when we do the corporate law case, Guilford Motors versus Horn, we will see. But the broad rule is that agreements and restraint of trade are void. There are some exceptions. So there are certain conditions under which the exceptions will be allowed. Okay, it must be necessary for the protection of the firm interest. So they have to show. So the burden of proof will be on the company. So if, let's say, you join a company and then you leave them and you join, say, some other company which is in the same business, which appears to be barred by your non-compete clause in the agreement, right? In that case, the company will have to sue you for violating the non-compete clause, and they will have the burden of proof. They will have to show that that particular clause is enforceable, okay, that because it falls under the exceptions. Okay, so yeah, that will be the situation. Yeah.
Sir, like in distributions, like there are distributors, so they are limited that they need to sell in the specific area only.
Yeah.
So is it the same void contract?
Again, don't use the word void contract. These are void agreement. You notice the Contract Act does not say void contract. It says agreements void. It does not say contracts void, agreements void. Okay. So yeah, it's a very good point actually that Shivam is making, that if distributors are restricted to selling in particular areas, okay, is that a restraint of trade? Again, that will fall under the exceptions, because that is how the business is done, that you have certain distributors who are in a better position to sell in particular areas. So that will be justifiable under the principle that these kind of restrictions are necessary for the benefit of for the conduct of business of the the other party to the agreement. Okay, okay. The rooster has not yet rung, so you shall have to be patient. Okay, yeah.
Sir, what do these agreement in restraint, what do these things fall on? What is the category under which they fall on?
The 25 to 30.
Yes.
This section 25 to 30. You're talking about this one, no? These.
Agreement in restraint of marriage.
These are all basically falling under. See, that's why you see in the notes I have given you here. Not hereby expressed in your own notes. Okay. Not hereby expressly declared to be void. This is section 25 to 30. So these 25 to 30 falls under the fifth filter of section 10. Okay, so if there are agreements by way of wager also, like some of you are familiar with stock markets, you know there's something called dabba trading, where you trade based on, you assume that I buy 500 shares of Maruti today, then tomorrow whatever is the price based on today's price versus that price, that difference amount, that if I make money then you have to pay me, if I lose money I have to pay you. That is called dabba trading. No shares are actually transferred. No shares are actually transferred. You are just looking at the prices, calculating profit and loss, and paying and receiving monies. No, options and futures are more organized, more well regulated. So this is called dabba trading, where you are just exchanging differences. No shares are being transferred or anything. So this dabba trading technically is not enforceable. It will fall under this bar. It will fall under this bar, agreements by way of wager. This will be considered a wagering contract. Okay, because depending on how much Maruti has gone up, I make or lose some money. This is a wagering agreement. Okay, and it is void under section 30.
What does that mean?
This is what is wagering, basically. Betting money on some uncertain events. It's like if it rains tomorrow, I pay you 5,000 rupees. If it doesn't rain, you pay me 5,000 rupees. Huh? Sort of. Lottery is again where there are some exceptions, because states have certain powers to conduct lotteries. So under that power it is allowed. So states are allowed, like even if something is declared illegal, they can collect money on that. So those kinds of things. So those are not enforceable by private parties, but they are under certain exceptions they can do that. Okay. So yeah.
What does it mean not hereby expressed by declared to be void? What does it mean? Like
yeah. What does it mean here? What does it mean? Means that there should not be, they should not fall in this not. You can see the not separately. Read the word not separately. Okay. Hereby expressly declared to be void. What is hereby expressly declared to be void? Hereby means in the Contract Act. And sections 25 to 30 are expressly declaring certain types of agreements to be void. So you will pass the fifth filter of section 10 only if you don't get hit by any of these bars. Only if it's not an agreement by way of wager, it's not an agreement in restraint of marriage, it's not a so not to all these. There's your 1 second. Okay guys, now 1 minute, don't get up. have I asked you, have I told you that the class is dismissed? The class is dismissed only when I tell you so. Okay, 1 minute. Now I have to give you some important notice, because what will happen is, see, the first case I have already discussed in the first class. From tomorrow onwards, you have to, from next class onwards, you have to do the readings and come prepared for Pharmaceutical Society onwards. The first case, Harvey versus Facey, I will release a video explanation of the case. Try to read the case and understand it. Harvey versus Facey is here. 1 minute, please be careful, just watch this. The first case I'm not grading you on. I will release a video explaining this case. And it will have some other discussions also. And then from the next case onwards, again next class onwards, I'm not going to be talking so much. I will just call people and isolate them, and then you'll have to present based on the questions in the readings file. Is that clear? I'll give you the release. I'll release the video for this. Harvey versus Facey, no grading. You guys start with Pharmaceutical Society from the next class onwards. Is everyone clear? You have to come prepared for at least one case in every class. And then I'll tell you, sometimes we may do two classes. Everyone clear about that? I don't want anybody saying what Yash and Anisha were saying today, 10 minutes and all that. You should know clearly what is required. Is everyone clear? Yes? Burma? Okay. All right, so now you can go. Next class onward, yeah. 1 minute. So this is an administrative minute. 1 minute. Let me explain what is required. This is part of the video so that everybody is clear. Okay. I have given you the readings file. Make sure it's all being recorded. Okay. All right. So this is the.
What is your ID?
My ID is there in the file, in the email which I used to share you into the folder. You can find my ID there. Okay. All right. Okay. So guys, now one second. You have the readings file. You can see the first case is Harvey versus Facey. I'm going to release there's no grading for this, because I will release the answer for this. Okay. Maybe some other material also. This will be released to you tonight. Okay. Now, in the next class, you will start with Pharmaceutical Society onwards. Okay. So I will call one person from each team. You have to be ready with the questions. Okay. Your issue prima facie is basically what is the specific issue in the case, and the underlying issue is how can you state it in a more general sense. Okay. In more general terms. I explain the case. So you have to extract you have to take out the case material from your contracts case. This is there in the folder. It's already said. You go to this folder, go to the case packs, or contracts file. There's a file called this cases contracts. You extract that file. This is what it looks like. You'll have all this, and the page numbers are given. So Harvey versus Facey is page 28. This is already going to be released to you tonight. And you find out where Pharmaceutical Society is, page 9. So you go to page 9 and read this case, and then you have to try and understand this question. What is the meaning of underlying issue and issue prima facie? This distinction has not been properly explained in your class, but I'll just explain it briefly here, that the issue prima facie is the particular issue in the case. Right? Let us say if there's a dispute between, say, Aurora and myself about a particular, whether or not we concluded a contract to transfer some property. Okay. Now, the issue prima facie in this case will be that whether Aurora had agreed to sell me that particular property. Okay, that is the particular issue. Then the issue stated, the underlying issue is basically stated in more general terms, that whether in the circumstances where if somebody, let's say, whether he verbally indicates there's a verbal agreement, whether that necessarily completes a valid agreement, or enforceable agreement. So the underlying issue is nothing but the same issue, which is not stated in such a way that it is very specific to the facts of that case only. It is a general principle that you can talk about. What is the general principle at issue? Like I gave another example in the other class, that if I have taken, let's say, Monira's calculator from her desk when she is not looking and placed it on my desk, okay, whether that constitutes theft. So the prima facie issue will be whether Brahm has stolen committed the act of theft with respect to Monira's calculator. Now the underlying issue will be the more general statement whether the act of removing an object from someone's proximity without that person's knowledge, whether that constitutes theft. This is clear. So you have to state the issue in more general terms. But you have to first listen to the explanation of Harvey versus Facey, okay, which I will release just now.
So you will call single person from each group?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Yeah.
So everybody has to read that test and
Yeah,
it's not
everybody I will call randomly.
Okay.
I will see who is least prepared and then I'll call that person.
Sir, so we are supposed to read the Pharmaceutical Society case.
Yes.
Yeah, for the next class you read Pharmaceutical Society.
And the first case is just for reference.
The first case is, I will explain, you read it for yourself, I will give the right answer, I'll release the video for
So it
that.
was
Give the
given
issue
6
plan
marks.
faces that these things also you will mention in that how we need to find out.
Yeah, so that will be
In the
there,
pharma case.
that will come later. See, this is where you move into the flip classroom model. Now, this one I'll give the answer for the first question. Okay, Harvey versus Facey. Now, when it comes to Pharmaceutical Society, now you get into the actual flipped classroom mode, where the teacher's not, where the evaluation is happening before the explanation. Remember, that is the distinction in flipped classroom. That you're flipping the thing. Flip means turn it upside down. Evaluation is happening before the teacher's explanation. You will first answer, you will be graded, and then the teacher will explain. So you're operating in a vacuum of sorts, but that makes the learning more intensive. So now the pace of the course will change dramatically because now you will have to do most of the work.
It will become a courtroom.
Yeah, okay. All right. Okay. So yeah. So I'll stop it here. So this is the explanation of underlying issue.
So we have to come prepared with these questions only.
Yeah. You have to prepare question number 2.1 and 2.2.
What about this? This is a general.
Harvey versus Facey, one minute. Harvey versus Facey is no longer going to be evaluated.
Okay.
You are not going to be graded. I'll give you the answer. That is just a test case.
We are graded on the basis of the second
You start from Pharmaceutical Society.
Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah. So you have to prepare these two questions and third 2.1 A, B, and 2.2. Clear? All right. Okay. So.